Hey there, BleepinJeepers, it's Tyler, and it's Wild Card Wednesday. So a couple weeks ago I showed you guys how to fabricate a console from scratch. This week we're going to take it a step further, and I'm going to show you how to make a cover for your ATV or motorcycle seat, including some minor foam repair. Now this will notch the skill set up just a little bit. It's a little bit more complicated than the console was, but not bad. This will teach you some essential techniques you're going to need before we move into recovering car seats and things like that that are quite a bit more difficult. So stay tuned and I'll show you how to recover your four-wheeler seat. So as you can see here, my seat is definitely in need of a recover. That's cracked, dried out. I'm starting to get some foam damage. So now's the time to get this repaired before the foam gets any more messed up. So the first thing I like to do is remove the hook mechanism, get it out of the way so that the frame of the seat will sit flatter. Make a note of the way the spring is oriented on this arm so that you can get it back the way it came out. Now I'm using a special tack puller to get these staples out, but there's a lot of different ways to do it. While you're doing it, if you happen to break a staple, stop immediately and remove that broken staple with a pair of dikes. If you don't, they're razor sharp, and when you move to the next staple, if you slip, it'll end up slicing your finger like this. You'd think after 25 years I'd figure that out, but anyways, important safety tip there. Go ahead and pull the rest of the staples out, remove the cover, and then bang this a little bit and make sure you get all those staples off of it and out of the way. And then inspect the foam. If the foam is wet at all, you need to set it out in the sunlight because it needs to be thoroughly dry before we start to do any repairs on it. Now I'm going to clean up my work area to get all those sharp little staples off. When I go to work on my new cover, I don't want it to get scratched or cut by any of those old staples. Now I'm going to clean the weed seeds, the foxtails, any dirt or whatever out of this little place on the foam that needs to be repaired. And then I like to use a product by Keystone Brothers. It's an upholstery foam. It's number 4011, general purpose. They call it their yellow label. I use this stuff for everything. It's great stuff. I'm going to squirt a little bit in the divot there in the foam, let it tack up. Once it's nice and tacky, I just take a cotton ball and work that cotton ball down into the void, and that's going to fill in this little gap here. Now, this may not seem like a big deal, but if you put a new cover over that little dent in the foam, you will see it plain as day. Now to keep that cotton from balling up and moving around, I put a little sheet of plastic over the top of it. That'll hold it in place. And just make sure that that repair stays where it needs to be. Once I've done that, I'll trim the excess plastic off. And anytime, as a general rule, anytime I do any foam repair at all, I will now wrap the entire seat in this 1/2 inch open cell foam. And that will hide all of the foam repairs that I've done and give me a nice, clean, smooth slate to start with. So I'm just going to go ahead and glue this to the main surface first, flip it over. Now I'll work around the sides, and then once this glue is tacked up, I'll go ahead and start molding this foam, being careful not to create any wrinkles. The foam stretches real nice, so it'll make all the curves, you just have to work it. And then I'll come back and trim off that excess foam, and once I'm done with that, I'm ready to start laying out the lines for my pattern. Alright, let's start laying out our pattern by making center lines. I'm going to make one on the back and the front. It's Very important you actually get these in the center, so take your time and do that. Extend them so that you can see them from the top side like that. If you've got a fairly flat work surface, then you can use a carpenter square like this to extend the one up the rear. And then just bring it over the top of the crest like that. Now I'm going to make 2 marks in from the back about 3 inches. It's not as important how far in you make them as it is that you make them in exactly the same spot on both sides. You're going to need these later as landmarks to get your pattern the right size. Now I do the same in the front, but I come back 5 or 6 inches and just make sure I get them in exactly the same location on both sides. Now I'm going to make 2 marks up front right in the corner of the foam where the foam starts to turn and head down on the side. I need to make sure they're the equal distance from the center. And you can see there how I've extended up the center line in the back. And then here is the mark. It's in about 3.5 inches from the back, and the one up front that's in about 5 or 6 inches. Now we make a straight line across the back, keeping it even with the top of the foam, and then you'll just have to eyeball this rounded corner, bring it up to where it meets the corner of the foam there, and then put some indexing marks. These are going to keep everything straight when we sew it together later. You know, keep in mind we're trying to make flat fabric curve around round objects, so we need to anticipate where the seams go to relieve the pressure and get the wrinkles out of that flat fabric. So here I'm kind of drawing a seam line. This will become my seam, and I follow up the curve of the foam where I know there's going to need to be some pressure relief on that fabric. Now I'm just going to find some scrap fabric I got laying around that I can use to make my patterns with so that I don't waste any of my finished fabric. So I'm going to use a very light dusting of this yellow label foam, just enough to hold this fabric on long enough to make the pattern. I don't want this foam to be sticky and gooey when I go to put my finished cover on. So I'll stick that there, just tacky enough to hold it in place. I'll mark my center line, and then you fold this down, and this is how you trace that seam line that you just drew on the foam. Be sure to make your index marks where you need to sew this together. You're going to need those later because the fabric really stretches. Now I'll work my way down and around, and I only need to do one side, but on the bottom now I mark both of those index marks and then trace along the bottom of the foam. Pull that out and it'll look something like this. Now extend your center line and cut out the pattern just to that center line. Now you can fold it over, and as long as you line it up with that other index mark, you should get this perfectly symmetrical. That's really the difference between amateurs and professionals in the upholstery world is symmetry. If this is not symmetrical, the human eye is really good at detecting that, and you'll notice it immediately that the two sides are not the same. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and work on the front. Again, a very light dusting of glue. I put my piece of fabric on there, trim off as much as I can. Now I'll go ahead and make my front index mark here, and then I'll go ahead and make the one up in the front corner. And again, I only need to do this on one side because I'm going to flip it over and trace it upside down to make the pattern for the other side. I'll show you that in a minute. So now I carefully work my way down, being sure not to forget to put my index sewing marks in there. You can see how you just take a Sharpie and work down around where this seam is going to be. And once you've worked your way all the way down, go ahead and pull that off. And I'm not going to add any of my seam allowances right now. I'm just going to go ahead and cut this out right along the lines. Now we can start to work on the actual main body of the cover. So I've cut a big piece of scrap here. Now I'll do this half of it at a time. So I start at the back, and that glue will just hold it in place long enough for me to pull the wrinkles out. I'm going to trace along the bottom of the frame here, mark where the front and rear index marks are, and then I'll make my center line. And again, I only have to do half of this now, so I'll trace this line down and around, making sure I get those sewing index marks where they need to be. Now I can work on the front, light dusting of glue, pull it up and get all the wrinkles out. And you can see here what would happen if I tried to just put a flat piece of fabric and stretch it tight. You just can't get those wrinkles out. So you do need to put some seams in this to relieve that pressure and get this thing to lay flat on this curved object. Alright, so I'm going to extend my index sewing marks, go ahead and cut this out. And now when I fold it in half, if I line up, you see I'm only cutting it halfway there. If I line up the left flap with where I've marked where the right flap goes, I should be able to get this perfectly symmetrical. So now I go ahead and trace around it, being sure to transfer my sewing marks. And once I'm done with that, I've got my 3 pattern pieces that I need, and we are ready to start transferring this to the finished fabric. Now I'm going to be using what's called Arctic vinyl. It's made by a company called Sprattling. You can see here, compared to the original seat cover, it's 3, almost 4 times as thick. This was the first seat I ever did as an upholsterer, and that was 25 years ago. You can see it's faded a little, but that Arctic vinyl holds up like you can't believe. It's great stuff. So now I'm going to start doing what's called nesting my patterns. That's just basically laying my patterns out on my fabric in such a way that I best utilize the space that I've got and create as little waste as possible. I like to put a weight on the pattern because they tend to move when you're tracing them. I'll transfer all the marks, and I've left enough space between them to be able to get a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So you need a minimum of 3/4 of an inch between the patterns. You'll see some of the lines are solid and some are dotted. The dotted lines are where I need to add fabric for stapling, and the lines that are solid will be my sewing lines. That's just sort of a system that I use to keep everything straight. Now you can see how I flipped that pattern upside down so that I have a right and a left side. Now you can see here you're going to need to add a 3/8 inch seam allowance for the sewing and about 1.5 inches for your staple strip. I've been doing this a long time, so I'm comfortable just cutting these out and adding the seam allowance as I cut. If you're not comfortable doing that, then use a ruler or a tape measure and mark your seam allowances and then cut them out. So once I've got these 4 pieces cut out, I'm going to start to transfer these sewing marks to the finished side just by marking them a little bit there. You can see that, how that red Sharpie shows up really good on that black. Now to sew this together, I'm going to be using a bonded polyester thread. Don't use nylon. Nylon is not UV resistant. You see that number 138? That's the thickness of the thread. You can use a 92 or a 138, but I wouldn't go any smaller than a 92. But as I was saying, polyester does not absorb moisture and it's UV resistant. If you use nylon thread, it won't last more than a year or 2. The sun just eats nylon for breakfast. So now I'm going to line up my sewing marks, and this is why I made all those marks, so that I can start at one side, and as I work around, I know whether or not to stretch the fabric to line up the marks and make sure I get everything centered. Otherwise, you have to start in the center and sew one direction, then go back to the center and sew in the other direction, which is really a big pain in the neck. So this is a system I've come up with to be able to just do it all in one shot like this. Once I get all of my pieces sewn on initially, I'm going to go ahead and do a test fit before I do what's called a top stitch. And then once I do the top stitch, it's like the French seam I showed you in the console. You're committed once you start to do the top stitch. So a top stitch is you pull one side of the fabric over. You can see the way the seams are laid out there. And then I'm going to go ahead and sew or stitch through all 3 layers. And this is a very cosmetic seam, meaning everybody in the world is going to see this, so you need to take your time. I like to sew my top stitch about 3/16 of an inch from the original seam. I find that's just a nice, visually pleasing distance. It also makes for a very strong seam. And I'll go ahead and do that on all 3 of the seams. So there's 2 up front and then the 1 long one in the back. And that's going to make that fabric just lay down nice and flat. It's going to be strong. Really, really looks good. And when you do this, around those tight turns, the fabric will have a tendency to pucker a little bit like that. So you just come in with your scissors and trim it off a little bit. That'll get rid of any little wrinkles. Once you're done doing that, we're ready to start moving into installing the cover. So I always use stainless steel staples on these seats because they are going to be out in the weather, and you're going to want to use 1/4 inch length, nothing any longer than that. And we start by lining up our seams and our center lines, and then just turn the cover right side out like that. Now I'll flip it over and I'll just put just a couple of staples in the back to get started, and then I'll flip and we'll go around to the front, pull it tight, and put 2 or 3 in the front, and then I'll go to each one of those seams and pull them around and just put a couple staples in them. I'll work one side then the other, and this will anchor the cover down, and then I can flip it over and take a look and just make sure everything's lined up before I start putting the rest of these staples in. Now the reason you only want to use 1/4 inch staples is as you come around the sides here, if you go any longer than that, they'll go through the plastic frame of the seat and through the foam, and even though they don't initially poke out of the fabric, as soon as something pushes against the side of that seat, you'll poke the staple right through it and it'll ruin your cover. So I wouldn't recommend you use anything longer than a 1/4 inch staple to do this. Work your way around. Make sure there's no wrinkles showing on the top side. And if you have to take the staples out and readjust a couple of times, that's okay. Now at this point, I'll trim off the excess fabric that I don't need. That'll give it a nice, finished, professional appearance. And once I'm done with that, I'll flip it over, do a final inspection to make sure that all of my seams are where they need to be. I don't have any puckers or wrinkles or anything. The last step is to reattach the hook and spring mechanism. Once I get that tightened down, I'm done. Now this process is basically the same for ATVs and motorcycles. Depending on the shape of the seat, you may have to put the seams in a little bit different location. But by and large, it's the same for all of them. Well, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you find this helpful. I hope that you'll go visit BleepinJeep.com and that you'll like, share, and subscribe. That helps us to keep the videos coming. And I'll see you next week.